Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be going back to a series I started at the beginning of the year, which is my author spotlight series, and talking about one of my favorite authors. I've said this before on the series. I have a pretty strict criteria for who's going to be featured in this. The first one being the author must be a primarily horror or thriller author. They have to have at least 3 works of fiction in novel form, and they also have to have books that I have read 3 of. I don't have to love all 3 of the books, but I do have to have read 3 of their books in that genre. And that's pretty much it, I would say. But yeah. So today I want to talk about Paul Tremblay. Paul Tremblay is a more modern horror author. He really started coming to, I guess, fame in the horror lit community back in 2015 with his big breakout novel. It wasn't his debut novel, but it was his big breakout novel, which is A Head Full of Ghosts, and has kind of been a rock star to a lot of people in the horror lit world. But he's also a very controversial author because of his tendency to write very vague endings, and a lot of people find him to be kind of an inconsistent author with the quality of his work. So I really want to dive into Paul Tremblay because he wrote one of my all-time favorite modern horror novels, and I think he's definitely an author worth checking out. So a quick background on Paul Tremblay. He has written 8 novels, 4 which I believe are all out of print, were originally released between 2009 and 2014, which were all released on smaller indie publishers. And then in 2015, he released his breakout novel, which is called A Head Full of Ghosts, which is currently being turned into a movie that is being produced by Robert Downey Jr. I have super high hopes for this film. I'm really excited about it. It is, to this day, Tremblay's most famous novel, and I'm going to talk about why in a little bit. And then in 2016, he released Disappearance at Devil's Rock. In 2018, he released The Cabin at the End of the World, which has also had the film rights sold, but I don't have any updates on when that is coming out as a film. And then in 2020, he released Survivor Song, which I actually reviewed, I believe, in February, and I will throw that review up in the cards. He also has a short story collection that was released in 2019, which is called Growing Things, and features the primary story Growing Things, which is also referenced very heavily throughout the 2015 novel A Head Full of Ghosts. In his other work, he is a juror for the Shirley Jackson Awards, which is really, really cool. Very similar to the Bram Stoker Awards. And then he, by day, when he's not writing, is a math teacher and a high school JV basketball coach in the Boston area. He's spent most of his time in New England, most of his life in New England. I believe he was born in Colorado, but has lived in Rhode Island and Salem and the Boston area. So a lot of his novels are set in New England. So out of his big 4 novels, I've read 3 of them. I am planning on reading all 4. There is a reason I haven't read the 4th one yet, which I will get into right about now, actually, as I talk about the novels that I think you guys should check out or not check out, what I've read and why. So I want to talk about his novel Survivor Song first. This to me is the weakest novel that I have read from Paul Tremblay. It was, I believe, a 3-star read from me. And it is Paul Tremblay's kind of post-apocalyptic end of the world novel. What's really interesting is this book is actually a microcosm for that. It isn't the end of the world, but there is a breakout of a super rabies virus consolidated just to the Massachusetts area, which I thought was really cool because you go into it, you know it's actually not the end of the world, but for the people in there, for the people in the book, they don't quite realize that it's the end of the world. I think for me, what didn't work with this book was the characters were just kind of okay. There was nothing very gripping about the characters. I found the story really interesting, and I found the trials and tribulations that our 2 main characters had to go through really compelling, but I didn't like those 2 characters overall. They felt very flat, very generic, very uninteresting, even though they were in a highly interesting scenario. And it was fine. This was a fine read. If you like Paul Tremblay, I would say definitely go and check this out. But it is the reason that I also haven't read The Disappearance at Devil's Rock yet, and that's because halfway through this book, our two main characters run into two other characters who are characters from A Disappearance at Devil's Rock. And I learned that after I read the book, because the whole time I was like, wow, these characters are actually the most interesting characters that I've read. I wonder why he's being super vague on their backstory. Well, joke was on me, they had a whole book about them. So that's probably why he was very vague, but I didn't know that. Unfortunately, I now know like what happens to them after, and I know a little bit about what happens to them in the book, so I'm kind of like, I kind of feel like I know a little bit about what's going to happen in Disappearance at Devil's Rock, as well as like what happens to them afterwards. So I guess I feel like I should have read Disappearance at Devil's Rock before I read Survivor Song, and I really wish I had known that beforehand. I normally wouldn't mind crossovers and references to other works, but I do kind of feel like with Tremblay being so famous for his vague endings, this could have ruined that other book for me. So that was a little disappointing for me. This book overall, it's just an interesting take on like an apocalyptic end of the world virus outbreak kind of story, with more of like a positive outlook, because it is a microcosm from the very beginning of what happens. It is a little depressing, I will say that. It is definitely a bleaker book, but a lot of Paul Tremblay's books are very bleak. So yeah, definitely a book that, like, if you like Tremblay's writing, worth checking out. Is it a must-read? Absolutely not. So then I have The Cabin at the End of the World. This book I really want to talk about because this book is definitely one of those books that everybody either absolutely loves or absolutely hates. And I completely understand why. This book is a ride. So the premise of this book is a family goes and gets like an Airbnb kind of cabin on like a lake or whatnot. And it's two men and their adopted daughter, Wen, and they're on vacation. And while they are there, a man shows up and says that if one of them doesn't kill somebody as a sacrifice on their vacation, that the entire world is going to end. The family is then put through all of these crazy situations where they are feeling pressured to kill somebody to stop the end of the world, except they don't actually know whether the world is ending or not, and are trying to figure out if these people are crazy who have broken into their house or if they are serious. That's the premise. I found this book really compelling, really heart-wrenching, really sad. This is a very sad book, but it's also a very good book, and a lot of the horror in this is the tension of the conversations and the uncertainty of whether the home intruders are to be believed or not. They do some pretty terrible things. And I will say that the ending is vague, and I think this is where this book gets a lot of hate from. The ending is very vague, but I think if you read this book as a love story between the members of the family, when you get to that end, the ending to me at least was extremely clear, and I totally understood where Paul Tremblay was coming from, what the point of this novel was. And it is definitely a little jarring, and it's a very depressing book, but I think almost like with, I say this with House of Leaves when I tell people to read House of Leaves, don't read House of Leaves as a horror story, read it as a love story with horror elements. I'd say the exact same thing is true here, and you're going to get so much more out of Cabin at the End of the World if you do realize it as this, if you do read it as this very avant-garde love story. I thought it was brilliant. This was a 4-star read from me, and the main reason it was a 4-star read from me is just because it didn't grip me as well as A Head Full of Ghosts did, which I will talk about in a moment. But I do think that this is definitely worth reading. Again, don't go into this book thinking you're going to be scared, and don't go into this book thinking you're going to have all the answers, but go in knowing you're reading a love story, and I think you'll be really satisfied. And it is a horror novel, but I think the elements of horror are way more subtle and emotion driven than they are like pop-outs or situational and like just downright eerie and unnerving. It's very much a personal type of horror versus a like physical action-based type of horror. But I do really love this book. I thought it was brilliant, and I would definitely see the movie if that comes out. Okay, And then the last book I want to talk about is A Head Full of Ghosts. I adore this book. I bought a leather-bound, gold-gilded, special edition signed copy of this book that I got from Cemetery Dance Publications. Signed by Paul Tremblay. I had to have it because this is just one of my favorite modern horror novels ever. This is a very unique horror novel. I originally didn't want to pick this book up because it is about an exorcism. It is about demonic possession, which is one of the number one things that actually scares me. I was raised Catholic. I'm not really Catholic anymore, but the one thing that always scared me in the Catholic Church is the idea of demonic possession. I won't read The Exorcist. I've seen the movie. It terrified me, so I was really worried about reading this. I thought it was going to scare me. This is a disturbing book. It's not a scary book, but it is a brilliant book. If you have read House of Leaves, I really can't talk about Paul Tremblay without talking about House of Leaves, because he does love that book so much, and it's very obvious how much he loves that book. In this book, he cites House of Leaves and Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle relentlessly in this book. I highly recommend reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson before reading this. It will definitely open up the book to you. And this is just a really cool modern premise. Basically, it's about a family, mom and a dad and their two daughters, and the oldest daughter, they believe, may be possessed by a demon. Instead of, going and, seeking like actual help for their daughter, they actually exploit her and have an entire reality television show filmed about her and her experiences. And then the book is told through the eyes of the younger sister, looking back on all of those experiences that she grew up with in the house and how the reality television show affected her and her family. Very, very interesting. And it's told in a really unique style. You get your full chapters of our main characters speaking, but then you have blog posts of people who have investigated the TV show and all of the history behind it and their own interpretations of what they think happened looking back on it, which I thought was a really cool way to kind of weave in Paul Tremblay's own love of horror. It's chock full of horror references to movies and other novels and other occurrences, and I just found this such a brilliant, brilliant love letter to the horror genre. I know I spoke about this when I did my review on My Heart is a Chainsaw, of how the way that book was a full-on love letter to slasher films. This is just a full-on love letter to the horror genre overall. And I think it's a very, very effective book. Again, Paul Tremblay loves his vague endings. I think the vague ending in this book actually benefits the book tremendously. It calls into question these ideas of religion and exorcism versus science and mental health, which is like probably the biggest driving factor of this story, and kind of just analyzes both on a pedestal together. And I can't say how much I love this book. I don't want to ruin anything about this book because I think just having the bare bones idea of what the plot is about is the best way to go into this book. Out of all of the horror novels that I read, I always end up recommending this to as many people as possible because like this and of course Stephen King's It, My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, and Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill, and even Clown in a Cornfield by Adam Cesare, I think that's how you say it, might be Caesar, I don't know. But those are like some of those big like modern horror novels that I'm like, everybody should read this. This is such a cool perspective of horror, and I can't emphasize enough how much I recommend this book. So those are my three books that I've read by Paul Tremblay. I will again eventually pick up Disappearance at Devil's Rock, and he does have a new book that is supposed to come out in 2022, I believe called The Pallbearers Club, but I don't know anything about it beyond that. I do hope it does come out in 2022. Sometimes they say those things and the books get pushed back a year, like Joe Hill and Up the Chimney Down. But yes, I do really like Paul Tremblay's writing style. If you don't like vague endings, maybe stay away from him overall, but I do think he does his endings in a way that are very effective, and he has kind of come out recently and said like, hey, I'm gonna try and stay away from vague endings because I know for some people it's a lot. But I do like how his books are very much open to interpretation. and they really allow the reader to make their own conclusions and then allow the reader to kind of take bits and pieces of Paul Tremblay's work and see the emotional response that he's trying to get out of them. Paul Tremblay is definitely an emotion-based horror writer, I would say. A lot of the fear that he puts into his novels and his characters come from emotions and tough decisions versus something that's actually scary. The scariest book out of all of these that I've mentioned is obviously A Head Full of Ghosts. It is about demons, it is about possession, and it is about like the horrors of like reality television and America and all of that jazz. But it is a brilliant, brilliant novel. Definitely the book to start with Paul Tremblay, in my opinion, and definitely the one out of all of them that's the most worth reading. Cannot wait for the film to come out. I think it's going to be mind-bogglingly amazing and beautiful if it's done correctly. So yeah, that is all that I have to say on Paul Tremblay. I'll link his website down below. And I have some more author spotlights that I'm going to be doing, scattering throughout the upcoming months. I'm going to try and do like one a month, I think. So if there are any authors you would like to see spotlighted, leave them in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like and subscribe button. It tells me what videos I should make more of thematically, and it helps me out a lot. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Thank you all so much for watching. Mwah.